Hello everyone, welcome to this presentation, the efficacy of a structured input component of processing instruction on young Indian rural ESL learners. My name is Litto Mathew and with me is Dr. Tannistha Dasgupta, and these are our photographs. I am a research scholar at VITAP University, Amravati, India, engaged in English language teaching research. I am also interested in exploring innovative methodologies to enhance language learning. Dr. Tannistha is my supervisor and an assistant professor at VITAP University, Amravati, India. She has a PhD in English language education from the English and Foreign Language University, Hyderabad, India. Now coming to the presentation is based on a classroom experiment with processing instruction. Processing instruction is a form-focused pedagogical intervention to teach grammar. It is predicated on Bill Van Patten's model of input processing. Now, input processing means the process by which learners make the initial connection between a grammatical form and its meaning. That is to say, how learners make sense out of the language they hear or read and how they get intake from the input. In this process, only a very small portion of input is taken as intake by the learners, and that is actually what we are looking into. And now the question is, why would L2 learners process only some elements in the input and not others? The input processing theoretical framework, in the attempt to address this inquiry, observe that learners rely on internal non-optimal processing strategies to process this input, and that is why there is a reduced intake. The input processing theory consists of two main principles addressing different aspects of processing. The first principle is called the primacy of meaning principle. It asserts that when L2 learners are exposed to input, they are primarily concerned with extracting meaning before they process the grammatical forms in a sentence. The second principle is called the first noun principle. It states that learners tend to interpret the first noun or noun phrase they encounter in a sentence as the subject or agent of the action. This tendency can influence how they understand the meaning of sentences, especially in languages where word order can vary or where the subject does not always come first. For example, in the case of English causatives and passive sentences, the learner might interpret the sentence incorrectly. Let's say the sentences, John had his car washed and the cake was baked by Mary. These sentences might not be understood properly by a learner. Each of the two main principles is further explicated with several sub-principles, which I'm not explaining now in this presentation. Processing instruction is trying to alter these processing strategies of learners through structured input activities. These structured input activities, they push the learner away from their non-optimal strategies that they normally use to make form meaning connections. Now, processing instruction has a greater impact on learners' developing system than an output-based approach to grammar instruction. Because unlike output-based instruction, which emphasize grammar rules and production practices, processing instruction alters how learners process input. Hence, there is better form meaning mapping, which results in a grammatically rich intake. In fact, the processing instruction ensures that focal attention is directed towards grammatical item and not elsewhere. It helps learners to rely on form and structure to derive meaning from input. If you look at the diagram given on the screen, you'll understand where the processing instruction treatment is actually given. It's given at the input level, not at the output level like other modes of treatment. Van Patten's theory of input processing was presented in its initial form in 1996. its modified form in 2004, and it's another modified form in 2007. One thing one pattern emphasizes is that processing instruction is a specific approach to explicit grammar instruction, and thus falls more clearly within the category of instructional treatments called focus on form. Since then, numerous studies observe that processing instruction is beneficial in enhancing the interpretation and production skill of the learners. In this part of the presentation, we will go through the major studies that have been conducted on the effect of processing instruction, and also we'll consider the aspects that the study have covered. Studies over several linguistic structures and target languages show that processing instruction is a successful and efficient pedagogical intervention, as I've already mentioned. Now, there are three major components in a processing instruction treatment. First component is the explicit information. The second part is information on the processing principle, and the third is structured input activities. Explicit information would mean that L2 learners are given explicit information about a linguistic structure or form. For example, third person singular ends with an S with a verb, or past tense, simple past ends with like ed at the end of the verb. These are the explicit information we will be initially giving to the learners regarding the grammatical form of a particular grammatical structure. Now, the second component, information on processing principle, means learners are given information on a particular processing principle that may negatively affect their picking up of the form during comprehension. For example, in the case of lexical preference, L2 learners are warned to pay attention to tense endings to understand when the action takes place, rather than relying on temporal indicators. For example, the sentence like I played cricket yesterday. The yesterday is the lexical part that gives a reference to the pastness of the action, and also I played, the ed ending of the verb also gives a reference to the pastness of the action. But a learner might always initially would focus on the lexical item, which is yesterday, rather than the ed ending verb. So we will give the information to the learner on this processing principle. The third component is structured input activities. And the structured input, the input is manipulated in particular ways to push learners to become dependent on form or a structure to get meaning. There are certain guidelines given by one pattern while preparing structured input activities. They are: present one thing at a time, keep meaning in focus, move from sentence to connected discourse, use both oral and written input, have the learners do something with the input, and keep the learners' processing strategies in mind. These are the guidelines we have to follow while preparing the structured input activities. Among all these three components, of course, structured input activities could be said as the core of processing instruction. Many research have repeatedly showed that the structured input component is the most significant variable within PI. In other words, structured input is the causative factor for the gains learners have already made. Structured input activities again are divided into two. First one is referential, and the second one is affective. I would like to quote from the work of Alessandro Gibanati and James F. Lee, the work named Research and Perspectives on Processing Instruction, for a better understanding of the structured input activities. Quote, referential activities are those for which there is a right or wrong answer, and for which the learners must rely on the targeted grammatical form to get meaning. In the following sentence, I walked with John in the park. Learners must decide whether this even referred to the past or to the present. Now, affective structured input activities are those in which learners express their opinion, belief, or some other affective response, and are engaged in processing information about the real world. In the following sentence, I visited Rome with my friends. Learners might be asked what they think about this and express an opinion on whether they think it is interesting or boring. According to one pattern, affective activities reinforce firm meaning connections established during referential structured input activities. Learners must be engaged in processing the input sentences and must respond to the input sentences in some way through referential and affective types of structured input activities. Unquote. We shall first look into some of the studies that have made to understand the effectiveness of the structured input component of processing instruction. As I've said, there are three components: explicit information, then information on the processing strategy, and structured input activities. Most of the studies have proved that structured input activities are the true reason for the gains students or learners gained. In 1996, one pattern and Oikonon had a study. 59 subjects participated in this classroom experiment. The students were studying Spanish in secondary school and were in their second year. The item investigated was the object pronouns in Spanish, and the processing principle under investigation was the first noun principle. There were three groups, and three groups were compared to obtain the results. One group received explicit information, the other received structured input activities, and the third received both explicit and structured input activities. We can call it like full processing instruction. Then the groups received 4 hours of instruction. The performance of the three groups at the pre-test level on the interpretation and production tasks indicated a very low level of knowledge on the use of object pronouns in Spanish. After the post-test, after the intervention, the post-test, the statistical analysis showed that the processing instruction and the structured input only group made gains, whereas the explicit information only group did not make any gain. And the outcome of this study is that structured input activities are responsible for the gains made by the learners. Similar studies were made by Penati. He replicated this study in 2004 and had similar results, and Wong and Farley also observed similar results. Like all these studies have showed that a structured input component of processing instruction is the cause for the gains made by learners. Now, moving to the comparative studies with other modes of instruction. Here also processing instruction showed positive effects, and the processing instruction learners in fact outperformed the learners from other modes of instruction, especially like traditional instruction. Comparative studies were made based on traditional instruction and meaning output based instruction and so on. This is a very quick overview through the table shown on on these slides. Benetti had a study with Italian future tense, and the processing principle was lexical preference, and the study was with 39 English native speakers. And the traditional instruction group was there, then the processing instruction group was there. Definitely the processing instruction group outperformed the traditional instruction group. Then another study in 2004 with the Spanish copula, that was a linguistic feature. That study was with 83 English native speakers, and there also traditional instruction group was compared with processing instruction group, and processing instruction group in fact outperformed the traditional instruction group. Similar studies were conducted these days through, and all these studies have proved the effects of processing instruction. Even some online effects were also tested in 2020 by Benetti with English causative sentences with 52 Chinese speakers, and in this study also the online treatment of processing instruction was effective compared with the traditional instruction. And another modes of instruction like meaning output based instruction were also part of the study, and the continuous research continued to show the positive result with the processing instruction and its positive sides. Now we are not considering all the studies, only looking into very few studies which have given the positive results. 2020, they surprisingly Bennett study with English causatives with Chinese learners, 50 Chinese learners, looking into the individual differences, especially the working memory and level of motivation. I actually did not make great influence on the gain of processing instructions students. This is something interesting. Even like individual differences can be treated in a better way with processing instruction students. Then transfer of training effects were also part of the study and identified there are positive effects. These are the studies. These are the continued studies. I've given references some of the recent studies in 2024 where the studies were made to understand the effectiveness of referential activities and affective activities, and the studies showed that referential activities are the reason behind the gain of the learners. In fact, all these literature from 1996 till date show that processing instruction is very effective compared with all other modes of teaching, like traditional instruction or any other output based instruction. Based on these positive results, we decided to move forward with the study in the Indian rural ESL learners context. So this study is an investigation on young Indian rural ESL learners' ability to adopt processing instruction to circumvent processing difficulties in interpreting English past tense sentences with ed ending verbs. We identified a research gap that little study has done among Indian young learners who are culturally and linguistically diverse on the effectiveness of PI. And again, this study is an investigation through intra-activity comparison rather than pre-test, post-test comparison among the young learners of age 10 to identify their ability to forgo the lexical preference processing strategy. The research questions are, do the structured input activities of processing instruction have any impact on young Indian ESL learners to interpret ed ending simple past sentences? Number 2, can the intra-activity comparison of structured input activities bring any statistically significant difference in the learner's ability to interpret ed ending simple past sentences? Coming to the methodology, we had 24 young ESL learners of age 10 from a rural school in Andhra Pradesh, India as participants, and these 24 students were identified from an initial pool of 39 students. These 39 students of class 5 were given a test to interpret sentences that end with ed, and 24 students were identified who scored below 60%. The target structure was ed ending past tense verbs, and the lexical preference strategy associated with this is lexical preference strategy is the processing strategy associated with this ed ending verbs. The material was our study avoided the explicit teaching or explicit information based on the previous studies, because structured input activities were the core component contributing to the gains of the learners. Based on that, we avoided the explicit teaching and focused only on structured input activities. So we had 3 sets of referential and 3 sets of affective activities, excluding the explicit information. The procedure was the actual intervention went for an hour, and we administrate 3 referential and 3 affective activities alternatively. Initially, worksheets were distributed. Each worksheet had 10 statements. The instructor read out statements once and gave a little time for the students to give their answers. So with their worksheets in their hands, once the instructor was reading the sentences, the students also could read through it, looking at it, and they were given time to give the correct answers. And once they have given their answers, the instructor gave the correct answer but did not give any explanation on the correctness of the answer. Regarding the referential activities, students were seated individually and they had to complete it independently. They were not asked to, they were monitored that they are not looking at each other or discussing it. Coming to the affective activities, students were encouraged to discuss among their peers, their friends, and actually decisions were made with the help of their friends. Then later these worksheets were collected after each activity and scoring is given. For a correct answer they were given 1 point and for a wrong answer 0 points. The results were obtained from the intra-activity comparison. In fact, there were no pre-test, post-test comparison. The only intra-activity comparison with the referential activities are considered. Paired t-tests conducted on scores from the 3 referential activities. Activity 1 was paired with activity 2 and activity 2 with activity 3 and finally activity 1 was paired with activity 3. The comparison between activity 1 and 2 and 2 and 3 were not significant. The p-values of the test results of activities 1 and 2 was 0.1075 and activity 2 and 3 was 0.217. Which do not carry any significant evidence to argue that the effectiveness of the treatment. But significant difference in means between referential activity 1 and 3 was observed. The p-value is 0.020, which is less than the significance level of 0.05. Here is the descriptive statistics of the 3 referential activities. A1 refers to activity 1 and A2, A3 refers to activity 2 and 3 respectively. And here is the result of the t-test administered. Now we identify that significant difference in means between referential activity 1 and 3 because we have the p-value below 0.05. Therefore we have to say that there is improvement from activity 1 to activity 3 as they moved, and the descriptive statistics also shows a gradual process through referential activities. Now coming to the discussion, we could say based on the research questions, the study could observe improvement in young ESL learners who are age 10 in their ability in interpreting ED ending verbs with structured input activities. Structured input activities have positive impact in facilitating input processing among young learners. Intra-activity comparison of referential activities were sufficient to identify significant differences because the test-natured referential activities provide real-time data on learners' improvement. Implications in ESL classrooms, incorporating processing instruction and structured input activities can enhance language learning effectiveness in ESL classrooms. Student engagement, processing instruction and structured input activities offer engaging and interactive learning experiences, fostering active participation and motivation among students. In curriculum design, processing instruction and structured input activities can be integrated into language curriculum design to specifically target areas such as past tense interpretation for improved learning outcomes. Teacher training, educators can be trained to effectively utilize processing instruction and structured input strategies to optimize language instruction and meet the needs of diverse learners. Finally, suggestions for future research. Future research on processing instruction must investigate factors like individual differences, motivation, and cultural and linguistic differences influencing the learners in the ESL context. The inquiry must focus on the long-term impact of structured input activities and its efficacy in language acquisition. Further inquiry with large sample size is needed to enhance the generalizability and reliability of findings. That's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much.